Hi there, welcome to Floating in Books. This is going to be my final wrap-up of 2024. I read 9 books since I last chatted to you about what I have been reading, and today I'm just going to be rounding up my thoughts about those 9 books so that next week I can let you know about my 2024 reading year in review. So yes, 9 books, but it was a chore, let me tell you, because I was slated to hit my 50 book reading goal already in November. I was like, oh, this is going to be easy the last time I talked to you because I was very, very close. But then I pulled a muscle in my back and I was just super exhausted and I didn't have the mind space to be reading a whole lot. So that's why I ended up hitting my 50 book reading goal just last Sunday, and that book will still be included here, and I'll tell you a little bit more about what I'm currently reading in my next video. So if you want to hear about that, stay tuned. And actually, a lot of this was also read while I was on vacation. So the last time I did a wrap-up, it was right before I left for Edinburgh, which you will have seen me vlog, and I bought some books there, and I also did some reading while I was there. A book I read while I was in Scotland is this bit here. This is Megan Nolan's Ordinary Human Failings, and this is a book I picked up when I was in London this year. So the last time I was in London, I ended up buying some books as well, and this was one that was shortlisted for the Nero Book Awards in 2023, so it sounded like it could be a nice lit fic, and it was. It is not a big book, but it did take me quite a bit of effort to read it, mainly because the typeset is incredibly small. So with some books, they are massive, but there is a lot of white space on the page. With this, everything is very crammed together, and the typeface is like 0.8. So it is really, really small. So even though this is only a 200-page book, it reads like a 350-page book. That's something to bear in mind. This is a lovely story. It is a little bit dark and bleak because it is about essentially a single mom and her family and all the people who are in her life. And we follow this family as their little girl, the one child that is in this family, seemingly commits a crime. And it's sort of as she's taken into custody, and these parents or at least the mom, her brother, and her dad, who all live in the same flat, are put up in this hotel by a newspaper to see as the story develops if they can control the narrative. That's essentially it. So it's a multiple POV story where we get some snippets from the point of view from the news reporter. We also get POV from the mom, from the dad, from the brother. And as the story progresses, we sort of see how this entire story came together, where all these people came from, their motives, their choices in life that haven't always been the best. So if you like gray characters that don't necessarily do the right thing, then this may be a story to get stuck into. So it was an interesting read, but it wasn't like super enjoyable because of the topic that's going on here. I mean, this is essentially a family who is not well off, and because of their lack of communication and their lack of understanding of mental health, they kind of spiral downwards, and they keep spiraling downwards, and they don't know how to get out of it. That's pretty much what this story is about, at least I felt. Ordinary human failings. I think that was sort of the premise of this book, is like this could happen to anyone depending on the choices you take in life. So it was an important book to read, but it wasn't necessarily the most enjoyable one. I ended up giving it 3 stars though, because it is well told. However, I did find it a little bit tedious at some points, because going by the blurb on the back, I thought we would get more of the mom and the little girl, and I hadn't expected the POVs from the dad and the brother, and their storylines were sometimes made more important than the other storyline. So it was like there was no storyline for that reason. So that's why I ended up not loving this as like more than I thought I was going to, but it was still a good one to read. So I think I'm just going to go in chronological order here. The next books I read on vacation, so these were ebook reads. I read Tender is the Flesh, and the author is Agustina Bazterrica, I think. I believe she's Argentinian, and this was a English translation of the book. And this was perfect for like Halloweeny season. So I was reading this over 2 days right before Halloween, and this is sort of like body horror slash social critique of how we treat animals at the same time. If you don't know what this story is about, Tender is the Flesh. We follow a man who lives in a world where all animals have died from some pandemic, some disease happened, and humans still need protein. So they have found an alternative protein source, and it's not plant-based, it's human-based. And the humans that are raised to be eaten are treated very much in the same way that we treat cattle who are brought to slaughter. And he works in one of these slaughterhouses, and we sort of, through his eyes, see like the social repercussions of this focus on eating humans and like the ethical choices around that as well. And we see him also regretting certain choices that he took, and he and his wife are estranged from each other. They haven't necessarily split up, but they are living separately throughout most of the story, because they had a child together who died, and he's very remorseful about that. And things kind of develop from there. This was definitely a story with a twist where I didn't really see the twist coming, which I usually am really good at guessing the twists in stories like this, but this one was really, really well done. I think this is an important book because of the critique on things like the climate and like, you know, social activism and how we treat animals. It's there as like a subplot, but it's not like explained explicitly. It's sort of like there underneath the surface, but at the same time you just get an excellently well crafted horror story, which I thought was really, really well done. This ended up being a 4-star reads, and I definitely think this is one of the better books I read all year. Not 5 stars, I'm just not much of a 5-star person. With a 5-star, I really want to be wowed, and the more I read, the less easily I'm wowed by what I'm reading, I feel. So I actually went back to my reading year last year, and also there I only had 1 or 2 5-star reads, and this year I had none. So I don't feel too bad about it, but I'll tell a little bit more about that in my video next week. The other book I started on vacation, but then I finished when I was home, was A Sorcerer Comes to Call by T. Kingfisher. This was another 4-star read for me, and this really made me realize that T. Kingfisher is an author I really have to watch. A lot of her books are on Kobo Plus, so it's a really great way to be reading a lot of her stuff. I read one of her books last year, but I think I listened to it as an audiobook, Nettle and Bone, and I really enjoyed that at the time as well. And this was, again, a really good one. The only way I can describe T. Kingfisher books is dark fairy tale retellings, because the baseline of this story reads like a classic fairy tale, but we're sort of getting more from like the villain's perspective and how they play out and how their badness comes to the forefront, rather than like the good guy who saves the day. So there is this really twisted, dark undertone with like your classic fairy tale setup, but because it is dark, it feels a little bit gloomy and gothic-y at the same time, yet it is set in a fantasy world. So A Sorcerer Comes to Call is about a girl who grows up with her mom, and it's very clear that her mother is not necessarily a nice woman, and that she can do some sort of magic, and she uses her magic to control her daughter. So her daughter is very scared of when this happens, and she is it's almost like domestic abuse. Like, there's no other way to describe it, but this woman has her sights set on marrying a rich man, so she takes her daughter across the country to meet with a nobleman who she's then going to try and enchant. And here's the thing, in this world, if you enchant someone to fall in love with you, the moment you marry that person, the enchantment kind of falls apart. So she knows she has to like woo this man in other ways than using her magic, and she's trying to enlist her daughter as, you know, part of her plot. But the daughter is starting to realize how she can like break loose, and she is starting to enlist some other people who can help her, who are in the household of this nobleman, to help her out and essentially prevent her mom from making things worse. And it was a really, really enjoyable story. I really enjoyed the sister of the noblewoman. She was this like wise woman who really sort of like helps this girl out, like an older sister almost, who's like, no, we're not going to let this happen to you. We're going to do this, this, that, and that. There were some really sassy characters in here. I felt they were very well crafted, and yet it read really, really super fast. It was a very fast-paced read, very enjoyable, and that's why it was 4 stars for me. And then we hit November, and there I only finished 2 books. And I think actually one of them I even finished like very early on in December. So I started 2 books in November, but only one of them I actually read within November. And the first one was an audiobook. This is Laurie Gilmore's The Pumpkin Spice Cafe. I saw this all over my book talk, and I was like, you know what? I'm in the mood for something very cheesy, very comforting. I was like, I know this is a romance. I'm not a huge romance lover, but this was still a 3-star read for me, which for romance is really, really good. It was enjoyable. It was predictable as no tomorrow. Like, you knew what was going to happen, but it was exactly the cozy, sort of comforting read that I was looking for. So it hit the spot just right, but only 3 stars because it is like very predictable. So this is about a lady who takes over a coffee shop in a small town. She used to live in Boston. She found her boss dead at his desk from a heart attack, and she's like, what's life for? I'm going to move away, and I'm going to start over. And of course, she meets the only single farmer in the town, who is this lovely, rugged man, and of course they fall in love. You already need to know. Like, you don't even have to know that that's going to happen, but how they get together and how they end up together, of course, has all the twists and turns of will they, won't they, and all the predictable stuff. But the town was really cute. There are these like people in the town who've lived there their entire lives who try to like influence her. There's a little bit of a mystery going on because why are things stolen? Why do people try to break in the middle of the night? So there is a bit of a mystery subplot, which isn't very well crafted. Like, this is not a well-written book, you guys. If you're just looking for something cozy, comforting, and a fun romp, I can recommend this, but don't expect anything more from it, which is why it's 3 stars. This is a physical copy that I read. This is The Untold Story by Genevieve Cogman. This is the final book in the Invisible Library series, so I can't say too much about the plot in this actual book, because I would be giving away all the spoilers for the series. But if you're looking for cozy fantasy, I don't understand, like, cozy fantasy is such a big thing online, and nobody talks about this series, and I think it is an absolute crime that no more people are talking about this book series. This is a fantasy, urban fantasy-esque kind of series, where there is an invisible library that sort of controls worlds, tries to keep the balance. And in the stories, we follow our main character, Irene, who works for this library, and she has to go into these different timelines to try and find books to help establish balance. In some worlds, we have fairies that take the ruling to, like, that are the ruling classes, and in other worlds it's dragons, and those fairies and dragons have different effects on these worlds. So it's very much like alternate universes. We encounter vampires and werewolves, and there's a steampunk element. And as the series progresses, each book is pretty much set in like a different time and place. So there's one book that is set in like Carnival Venice in like the 16th century. There's one that's set in 1920s gangster-filled Chicago. There's one that's set in 19th century London with steampunk elements. So because of the influence of the dragons and the fairies, these worlds are very much magnified, and the tropes that we hear a lot about in literature or like in history are like exaggerated to the max in a lot of the storylines, which has to be your cup of tea. I liked it because I just kind of see it as like a fantasy element to the story. I mean, it's very obvious this is not trying to be historically accurate. But there is that history element to it, which I enjoy. There's books. There's a little bit of romance. There's a snarky Sherlock Holmes-like character in this story as well. And for the most part, there's a little bit of politics and intrigue as well. So as the story progresses throughout the 8 books that this story is long, you're going to find different elements to the story. And this was only 3 stars though. I think it's the lowest rating I gave any book in this series. I think most of them were like 4 or 5 stars for me. It was just trying to wrap up everything very nicely with a neat little bow, which is usually not my cup of tea. I like it if there are dead ends, and if not everything has an answer, and with this, it was just trying to be a little bit too neat and clean for my liking. It was still enjoyable. These are very fast-paced, and like I said, if you want cozy fantasy and you like a more urban setting, then these might be actually for you. Then I read another ebook in December. This is Robin Sloan's Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore. And this was something I knew nothing about. I just randomly found it on my Kobo Plus, and I was like, I can sort of read it for free, so why not give it a whirl? So I decided to try and read this, and oh my, this was such a fun story. This is exactly up my street. It's nerdy, it's got books, it's got a mystery plot, it has a secret society. It was excellent. In this story, we meet a guy who's lost his job as a graphic designer at a marketing firm, and he's looking for a new job, and he finds a job advert for Mr. Penumbra's 24-hour bookstore to be the night shift, pretty much from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. There's only 2 other people working in the store, Mr. Penumbra himself and another guy. And it's very, very quickly clear to this guy that this isn't just your average bookstore. Sure, it sells books, but there's also these regulars that come in time and time, and they ask for books from the Wayback List, which he knows nothing about. They're filled with scribbles that he can't read. So what's going on here? And then there ends up being this entire secret society that has to do with this Wayback List, and it keeps spiraling further and further. There's coding involved, so if you're like your computers, it's set in San Francisco, so there's references to Silicon Valley in here as well, and a bit of Google-esque stuff. So there's coding, which is the nerdy bit. There's books and a bookstore, which I like, and a little bit of mystery with this secret society. I really liked it. I thought the characters were really well crafted and incredibly funny. It was a bit snarky and witty at times, so I definitely thought that this was a good one. Was it a perfect book? No, that's why it's not 5 stars, but I definitely gave it 4 because I had so much fun reading it. And then I listened to another audiobook on my Storytel app. So this was by Freeman Wills Crofts, and this is the Hogs Back mystery. And this is part of the British Library Crime Classics. I think that's what it's called. It's this series of books that are like classic British detective novels. And I haven't read any of them. And I was like, you know what? I think I can listen to it. It was written by it was read out by this very prim and proper British accented voice actor, which was actually enjoyable to listen to. And this is your classic detective novel that made it tedious at times. So I think, yeah, it was a 3-star read for me for that reason. The case itself was very cleverly crafted, I have to say. But it did what some older style detective novels tend to do, which is detectives explaining to other detectives what their line of reasoning was, how they got to the solution, which I'm so glad we've gotten over that because it's incredibly tedious. There are entire sections where we just have this detective trying to unravel the mystery and all of his little thoughts going into it. And then we get him explaining, like towards the end of the book, we get like 100 pages of him just explaining his train of thought and how he got to the solution of the crime to other detectives. And there's like all these side quests, like, oh yeah, they remarked this and that. Let's have another glass of whiskey. So it felt a little bit tedious at times. There wasn't a lot of focus on the plot for that reason. I think this book could have been cut in half if we just stuck to the actual storyline and not have these side quests of this detective that is explaining everything that are incredibly tedious. But that's why I'm happy that I listened to it rather than reading it on a page. I think if I had read this on a page, I might have DNF'd it. Not because it was terrible, but for a modern reader, it's just not what we're looking for anymore. So this was enjoyable. I can't say much about this because I would give away the plot, because it is a detective, like red herrings, and it's your classic whodunit kind of story. But essentially, this policeman comes into play when a man he's pretty much gone missing, and the question is at first whether he's just gone missing, whether he ran away, whether he was kidnapped, or whether he was murdered. And he leaves the house. It's the vibes I got from this book was Downton Abbey meets Agatha Christie. It's like Downton Abbey-esque settings with these higher upper class people who do have cars. So it's not like super duper late. Like it is somewhere at the start of the 20th century. You can tell that from how they talk about things. And I think they already have telephones and stuff. But you can tell it's like upper class people who live in the countryside and will like meet each other, and like they all know each other really well. And then this man goes missing. And the question is, why did he go missing? What happened to this man? And as they're trying to find out, more and more stuff happens. And that's all I'm going to say about that. And one of my more disappointing books of the year was one I did read as a physical copy. This is Masters of Death from Olivia Blake. This is the second sort of thing I've read from her. I read all the books in the Atlas 6 series. I think I started it last year, finished it this year. And this sounded so much fun when I read the blurb. I was like, okay, I want to give it another shot. This is about... It's about a whole cast of characters, which was the thing that annoyed me most. There was no focus in this story. It didn't really fully get underway until 300 pages into it. The first 300 pages were such a chore to get to. It takes 200 pages just to get to know all the characters, because there's like 20 characters that we follow or something crazy like that. And then the interesting bits where it all comes together is just the last 80 pages. So many people, like I've seen so many reviews of people loving this, saying things like, oh, it's like not really until the end that everything comes together that you understand the plot. I'm like, this doesn't even, like, there are no hints to this being the resolution. There's nothing there. This is just a badly crafted book. So for me, this was a 2-star read. Essentially what this is about is we follow the godson of death, who is a mortal, but he sort of like moonlights as a medium, and he can call upon death to sort of communicate with spirits. But then death goes missing, and something's going on. And there's also a vampire who happens to be moonlighting as a real estate agent, and she's trying to sell a house that is still occupied by a ghost. The ghost, the vampire, this godson of death, death himself, as well as a whole host of religious and mythological characters are roped into this storyline for no other reason than there needs to be a storyline. It just wasn't good. And no matter what some people are saying, I've read some of the reviews online on this with people who've loved it. Oh, it's such lyrical writing, and it's this and that and that. It's just a badly crafted plot. Because of all the POVs, because of the entire cast of characters, where you don't know who is who. Because when I started reading this, the character of death also has a few chapters where they are the narrator, and they're incredibly snarky and this like know-it-all sort of person. So I thought, yes, this is going to be a lot of fun. But then, of course, Death is kidnapped, so he disappears, and then he no longer tells anything anymore in the story, which I just felt was, I don't know, this book just really set me on the wrong foot, and I didn't enjoy it one bit. This is an instant declutter. And the final book I read, I wanted to go for something small because I wanted to make sure I could hit my 50 book reading goal for the year. It's the first time in 8 years I actually hit it. I always set it on 50, and the only time I actually made it was in 2016 when I did the Goodreads reading challenge for the first time. And that year I really read things like graphic novels and like small novellas that were like 80 pages and stuff just to hit that reading goal. And I remember thinking other years, like, no, I just want to read. And the reason why I set a reading goal is to make myself read more, watch less TV, read more. That's always been the game here. But now I was like, you know what? I think I can read this in a day, and then I can film my video afterwards. This is one I picked up in Edinburgh, so this is a pretty new book in my collection. It's Celia Fremlin's Don't Go to Sleep in the Dark. And this was really enjoyable. I had never heard of this author. Apparently her books were reissued a couple of years ago. And she's a British author who, I think this was published in like the late 60s or the 70s. So she was writing a lot of her fiction in the 60s. And she sort of falls within the noir, gothic-y kind of category, you could say. I found this on a table at Golden Hair Books, where they had this entire display of all these books that they recommended for like Halloween season, that sort of thing. These stories aren't necessarily scary though. It's not horror, it's not anything like that, but every single story has something dark and twisted to it. This is because it is a short story collection. I don't think I said that. So each story is only like 20 pages or so. Some of them are a bit shorter, some of them are a bit longer, but it's all about like women and children and their relationships in the domestic sphere. And it's very much your like classic, domestic settings. It's very much about women who don't feel seen by their husbands. It's very much about women trying to take up more space than they're allowed to in society. It has all of those elements. It's about children who aren't being loved. So it very much taps into like a lot of like domestic issues, I think, and it makes them dark and twisted, and I thought that was very enjoyable. After reading the entire book in a day though, I don't think I would recommend that to anyone, because after a while you see the little endings, like you can sort of predict what's going to happen, because every story has like a similar setup. So every story kind of works at a similar pace, where if you've read a few, you kind of know what the spiel is going to be. But this was enjoyable. It was great to read something by a female author, and I definitely want to read some of her longer form stories. There are a couple of novels that she's published as well, and those I think I want to read as well, but I need to see if I can track them down. So those are all of the books that I read in, let's say, like late October until right now. I only finished the other book a couple of days ago. I am currently in the midst of 2 other books, but I don't think I'll be finishing those until it's already 2025. So they are going to count towards my 2025 reading challenge. And I'll tell you more about that in my next video that will go up next week. But I'm going to be filming it right after this one. So if you'd like to stay tuned for more. Yes, I haven't stopped doing bookish content. I got a comment the other day saying, I'm missing your book videos. I'm still doing them, but I need to read in order to be able to do book videos, which isn't always feasible for me. So if I'm super busy or if I'm in a lot of pain, I just can't read as much. So most of this was read in December, so I definitely caught up on things, but that meant that by the time I can film a video, we're 2 months later, and that seems to be the pace that I can like film these kind of wrap-up style videos, is like once every 6 to 8 weeks. So I would love to be able to make more bookish content, but it just makes it a bit challenging because my reading pace isn't as high as other people who make bookish content online. And I have a job. I also have my other channel. This is just something I do on the fly. So I hope you don't mind. They're still here. Bookish videos aren't going to go anywhere. Don't worry about that. I just can't do them as often as I even would like myself to do. I just can't do them as often as I even would like to do them myself. So thank you so very much for joining me here today. Thumbs up this video if you liked it. Subscribe to the channel if you want to see more by me. I do these kind of videos once a week on here. I also talk about fashion. I also do some vlogs from time to time. So it's sort of like a behind the scenes sort of look of everything that I've got going on in my life. So thank you so very much for joining me. And then I hope to see you again very, very soon. Bye-bye.